Hello everyone, this is Ashutosh Mahto from Mindfire Solutions, and I have been working with Mindfire Solutions since last 3 years, and I have been working with .NET framework mainly in ASP.NET, basically with JavaScript and in ASP.NET MVC. So my this presentation is on model binding in ASP.NET. So today we will be talking about a little bit about MVC, what is MVC, and what are the different components, and then what are models, how model binding comes into action, and how we can bind data into our views, and how can we pass from controller to views, and then how model binding actually happens, and some of about view models in MVC, and how can we customize models. So let's start with model view controller. Model view controller is an architectural pattern that separates our web application into three components: view, controller, and models. View represents your UI, your presentational part, while controller controls the model and views the flow of data from one part to another part, and model represents your actual data represents your actual data domain. It provides the facility to get the data from your database and store and update, like those functionalities. So MVC is very popular and has become a standard design pattern, and it it provides better separation of concern. Yeah. All things are individually separated from each of the layer, and it provides more control over rendered HTML in views. It provides better support for test-driven development and unit testing. Also, it is very flexible and extensible. There are different paths we can extend in MVC, and that is easily pluggable, and you can say that it can be easily included with different paths, right? So now we talk about what is model specifically. So model provides persistence mechanism in MVC, that part that deals with the data domain of your application. It is a representation of domain of application, and it is not actually the physical thing, that physical data. It is a conceptual thing, an object that represents the actual data that resides in your database or any other data source. So it ensures data integrity and allows to flow data through objects. Now, how do we bind data from action to views? So first we will see how, without using of actual model objects, we can send data from our views to action or action to views. Actually, data binding occurs over here, but without using of models. Now, how that happens? We have two things: view data and view back. To send our data from action to views, through controls we can pass the data into view data or into view back, and then send to the view. Similarly, from view there are different ways. For example, form parameters, that is the traditional way. Form parameters, query string, and then request object. In ASP.NET there is a request object through which we can send our data from the request, and then route parameters. So these are the different ways. Now we will see how we can send this data from one layer to another layer. So let's start with our demo. So this is a simple library application, and you can see that uh, it's data. This is the schema design of our application. This is very simple, and I have not added any constraint like foreign key or any relationship for now. But this when actually we work with our application, we have lot better better than far better than this design. This is a very simple thing. I have just made it for purpose of demo. So now switch to our application. So we will be first saying how we can use simple request object. So I have categorized my demo into different paths. I can use request object, how we are using request object to send data from views to action. Then we will see how binding happens to primitive types like string, int, etc. And then how we can use simple objects. Then we will be using complex objects. Then what is view model? When we will see what is view model, then we will be using this demo. And then how we can customize our model binding, right? So let's start with request object. So this is a pretty simple form. We can add a category and description, and the category should be added to our database, right? So what actually happens over here, let's go to first the code of this one, add category. So what we have done, this whole thing is in Razor syntax. We have used a simple form, and it has two input elements. You can see one is for category name, one is for description with name, category name, and description. Now when we add data, when we submit the form through this button, submit button, the whole form data goes whole form data is contained into request object and is being sent to the server. So let's add a category. Now we add this category. So we can see that category has been added successfully, right? So let's see whether it has been added or not. You can see that there is no business category, right? Now execute this one. So this is what we have just added, right? So what actually happened here, let's add a breakpoint over here in our controller. This one. So what actually happened over here, that from this form, category form, we send data, and that came into this request.form object. We check if there is data from request or not, and then we use this form object to these keys. And you have to ensure that this name should match exactly with this name, category name and description, and this should be exactly matched with this name. Similarly, we can directly send through request object also through keys like this. And third thing we have to know about view back. So like I said over here, that we can send our data from views to action through form parameters, query string, and route parameters. Similarly, we can send data from action to views through view back or view data. So I have just bound view data to an object, and this is dynamically maintained. You have to add data, you can just add view back, and whatever object you want to add, you just add it. It dynamically binds the data. And when we are displaying the data into our view, we have to simply use the same thing, okay, and the success message appears. So this is what happened in just now, right? Now let's switch to our second demo, binding to primitive types. Here I'll be showing how query string can be used to pass our data. So this one is get books by category, this one is our demo, and let's click into this one. So there we have sent category as a query string. And what happens when we send a request with query string, it just goes into controller. Let's close this one and open this one. So here it is just passed into this one. This is how models bind with query strings. We simply pass the data and the query string, this should be exactly matched with the query string, this one. So what happens that our model binder comes into action. It first checks for the data that is coming and then matches that whether these are there or not. So it catches the data, and then we are using link query to query our database, and that gets the category ID, and then we populate a list of books, and then we add it into view bag, and then we can see that in this get books by category we have a view bag. So in this view bag we just displayed the book title and description which we are seeing over here. So this is what demo for simple query string. And now let's switch to another. Now using model binding in MVC, there is a model binder. So how actually model binding happens? There are basically two phases of model binding. When we post our data from form, first we uh, the first phase is the value provider comes into action. The value provider checks for different values, like I have just explained you over here, that we have a category query string. So the value provider checks what are the different value providers, like query string, cookies, or you have different form elements, request objects. So these are all value providers. So value providers just serializes this data and then pass to model, and the model binder just binds the data into our model. So this is what happens over here. Now model binding is when we need strongly typed data bound to our views, then we use model binding, and it has more control over data, as we know that when our application grows, then it is very difficult to maintain dictionaries which has we have to pass keys, for example view data or view bag. Since these are dynamic things, we have to keep track of the objects we are assigning. But in case of model, we can just assign the model and we have a concrete structure for our models. So this is very easy to maintain, and it has more control over data and less repetition of code. Since you are using view bag or view controller, in each view you have to define the view bag and view controller for each of the data. If you are using the same object, the same data model, then you have to repetitively define the view bag and view objects. So it is more flexible and extensible. We can also extend the data in our models. So now let's see how simple model binding happens. For simple model binding, we are first how we are binding model into our view. The first thing we do, that we send empty model, right? So this empty model is being sent to the view. Sorry. So this empty model is sent to the view, and now when we run this application, the form is bound with empty data, right? So this is actually bound through this empty object. So through this empty object we bound the data, and we can see in the you can see add book CSHTML. You can see that we have included this model. So whenever we are using model binding, we have to first define our model that has to be used inside our view, and through this model we can simply define we can associate our model with its properties, and we can also use HTML helpers over here like this, and then we can use model binding. So what we are doing over here, we first defined our model and then we used HTML helpers to associate the model properties with individual text box accordingly. Now whenever we provide data into the the text boxes, these data are mapped to the properties associated with it like this. So whenever we pass any data, that will be going into the mapped with your title property of that book object, this one. So let's add a book, add a new book. Before that, let's see what is inside book. So there are 12 books. Now we are adding the third one. So we added a book. So book has been added successfully. Let's check this one. So this is the book we have just added. Now how it happens that it is bound to this one. Now when we send the request object, the value provider checks for that object. So let's go to home controller, and then we see that we have passed an object in our action method. So what happens, value provider checks for the incoming data, and when it checks that the associate model has been passed, then it simply deserializes it, and model binder takes care of it and associate with this one. Now this adds and save the changes, and the data has been saved into the database. So this is now through view bag we can send our data. Now we can also see that through view data we have sent a message. So this is what this is how our model is being bound. So this is a simple binding. Now in case of complex objects, how that happens. So let's change this one to model. This was our first demo where I had shown you through our view back, and now we will show through complex objects. So here we have associated the data with a list of books. So this is our complex object where it is actually a list, not a individual model. And in home controller we can see, we can go back to this one, complex object, and now we are passing a query string over here, the same we have seen a few minutes ago. We will pass category, and that will check for all the categories, and then it will get all the books from that category, and we are assigning this book to a list, and that list will be given here. So previously in this code, what we have done, we have assigned that to view bag, right? So view bag is dynamic thing, and here a list of book is more strongly typed. We can define that this is actually related to book model. So now let's run this one again. So now for complex object, what happens that we send the query string from here, it goes to our server, and then from this data we can fetch the ID for that category, and we get all the books and we bound to a list, and then again we pass the model into this view. So let's check the get books by category view, get books by category view, and here we see that it has been bound to this one, and this model, through this model we can simply display our data, right? So this is how we can send complex data, complex objects. Now let's come to view model. So now what is view model? View model is nothing but a specific object that combines different properties of different models. So there are certain scenarios where our view needs to be associated with more data than individual data model represents. Suppose we have book, and then we have members, and then we have authors. Suppose we want to display whole combined data that which book has been written by which author, the whole book details, how many times it has been taken. So the whole data does not contains into a single model, right? So we have to associate all those data into a single entity, and that is where our view model comes into picture. So we define our customized view model, and then we associate that view model to our views. It provides better flexibility and extensibility. We can extend the data from different models, and then we can reduce uses of viewbacks and view data. So as we can see over here, for each and every time when we populate the data, uh, this one we are using viewback, right? Or say for example this one, sorry, this one, or with simply add book, this one, or this one. So with this book we have to send categories also, but there is no way we can associate category with this book model. So what we did, we simply added the categories into the view bag and we send that. But in place of this view bag, we can also use a customized view model in which we can set the book and the category data together, and then we can send. In place of these two, we can simply pass the view model, and that works exactly like a model in CSHTML files. So we simply replace this with our view model. So this is what we will be going to see in our next demo. So when we click into this one, this shows the whole book details, right? The book issue history in which we have members name. So there are different members that are not associated with the book details. We can see over here. This is so this is a different model, and our book is a different model, but we want to see all the data together. So what we did, we created a view model, book view model. In this view model, what we did, we combine everything like this, book details view model that contains all the book details. You can see this is directly the book model, and then book issue history view model. To display the history, we have a separate model for book history and then members, but those data are combined, like book history who has added which view. We can see that in book history we don't have names of any member, right? So we associate this one with issue id, issue date, submission date, and member id, member first name, right? And we will see how we add this data. We just made a model that is specific to our view, that is necessary to our view, right? Not all the data. So now come to our home controller, and now we will see how we are using these things. Let me first minimize these things so that it will be more clear. Now what we are doing here, we are simply using this one, and we are passing our simple book view model. And now inside view model, we are going to display get book details, and here we have found this view model. So like you have seen in models, we have passed the models, we can directly add this to view model. This exactly works as in model. So this is the same thing. Models are actually the representation of objects, so this also acts as a model over here. Now let's run this application first. And now show our view model. Now here we can see that we just passed the book ID, and that is we have passed through. Let's minimize this one so that we can see only necessary code. Sorry. So this one. So here we can see that this book ID, we can pass the book ID, right, through query string, and through this book ID we first populated the book details property, which has been defined in our book view model. This one, book details, that is our related to our book model. And then if book details, since this is bound to this view model book details, we first check if book details is null or not. If it is not null, then we get all the history, and we join the data here, book issue history and member, and the whole join data is passed into the book issue history view model. So in case of join, when we have data coming from multiple tables, we can use view models to show the combined data, right? So here we have used member first name, last name, and issue date. So only these two properties from member object and these two property from book history, and we have assigned to history. And now we pass that view model. This view model came into our this view, and here we can see that model dot book details, that is representing our book details, book model. And then inside issue history we can see that in issue history it represents book issue history view model. So in book issue history view model we have member first name, last name, issue id, issue date, submission date, right? So the same thing is being assigned here. Member last name, member first name, submission date, and issue date, and those are appearing over here. So this is how we can combine our view model. Now let's see how can we customize our models. So to customize model, we have to understand what is inside our model binders. So model binders is actually created from iModel binder interface, and it has different type of uh, like HTTP posted file based model binder, byte array model binder. So these are different model binders that works differently. Like for example, when we use simply query string or form data, then default model binder comes into action and that binds it as a default object. And similarly, these have different works. We will not go deeper into that one. Now how custom model binding happens here, we have to first bind the custom object using iModel binder. So whichever model we are extending, we have to first bind that. So for example, in this scenario where we need custom model binding, there we have to add a custom book where we have a book code, right? So let's go to the book table. So we have a book code, right? And that book code contains the book book category ID. There you can see the category ID, and then the first three letters of your book. So this is a simple logic. There is nothing behind this one, nothing. So this is just for demo purpose. I have just set randomly. So in case of custom model binding, we are passing the title over here, we passing a description over here, but we are not providing the book code. Book code is automatically generated, that should not be given by the user, and that should be a string that has to be combined with that should be a combination of the title and the category, right? So for simplicity, I have not mentioned any category. By default, it will take category 1. So let's pass the a simple book name. So this is what book. Now the book has been added over here. So you can see the data has been added. So our category is 1, and this one is the first 3 characters from your title, right? So how this actually happens, in this case we have used custom model binding. So there in custom model binding, we generally use when we don't want to change the data through our views, and that data should automatically be manipulated. So in that case, I have used this one, and for example, I have bound it to book view model. So whenever the book view model is being processed, then individually one of the properties is being treated uh, and automatically processed. So in this one, what we have done, simply we added a model binder, book model binder, and that extends iModel binder interface. Now in bind model method, we define the binding that has to be processed. For example, we have we are getting the data from request object directly, and then we are processing the data. We are getting category ID and we are generating the book code. Now we see over here, when we go to our home controller, while saving the changes, we are simply getting the book code. But if you see, let me stop this one, and if you see, we have not passed anything apart from these two fields, title and description. We have not passed anything, but that comes automatically. Ideally it should come as null. For example, run this one, go to custom model binding, we add test book, test book, we add book. Now let's go to our DB and check what data it has. Actually, I have to build this one first. So after building this one, let's go to there and now see what happens. So we added a test book, sorry, now we add this one. Now we can see the book code is coming as null, right? So when we process the data, run this one, and we can see another data with null. But previously we have seen that there is a data with a code. So how it happened? The actual thing is, I have not bind the model binder, right? So there are different ways. The first thing, we have to bind iModel binder, and then we have to implement that custom model binder, right? For example, here we have implemented this one, so we can simply register the model binder with this one. Let's first we'll come into this one. We can simply add this into this one also, like this. After registering this, So now we can see that on registering this one we can get the data, right? So this is done. This one, right? So this is how we can bind our custom object. Now let's see this one, what was there. So when we have to use global.asx, we can also register this binder in our application start method in global.asx, and just let's just remove now this one is done, and now run this one. And our book, and add our book. So now we can see that we are getting this book code like we got few minutes back. So we continue with this one, and let's check with our data. Sorry, this one, right? So we can see that we can also customize our object through registering in global.asx, right? So get back to our slide. So this is custom model binding. So this is all about our model binding, and you can connect us in mindfiresolutions.com. These are our Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook URLs. You can connect with us with these URLs. So thanks for today. Thanks.